What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the final part in the Inside the Score series for my piece Tranquility. Thank you very much for coming along with me on this journey so far. And if you haven't seen the first two parts where we talk about the music theory and the orchestration, I definitely recommend you do so. It will contain a lot of information that I hope will be useful to you. And so, yeah, in this final part, we're talking about the mixing and the processing, which is a lot of fun because this is kind of the part where we get to take all of our raw tracks and start bringing them up to a really professional level that's, ready for release and, for the world to listen to. And that's always the exciting part when we can actually release music we enjoy and are proud to show people. So anyway, before we get into it, I'd love to point you to my mixing and processing guide that's absolutely free, but it's a guide I put together containing my exact mixing process, the 6 steps I use to approach a mix every single time I'm working on music. So if you check the link in the description box, it will take you directly to that. You can download it 100% for free and keep it with you for your next mix when you're all done your mock-up and you're ready to take those raw tracks and really polish them up and make them sound as good as they can. So that's the first link in the description. Just check it out, and it's totally yours as my gift to you for watching this video. Second of all, I should let you know that this piece Tranquility was written as part of my flagship course Cinematic Music Creation. So that course is basically where I take you through the entire process of composition, orchestration, arrangement, production, mixing and mastering, everything. There's a module on music theory, there's one on sample libraries, your mindset and everything. So if that is the type of thing that interests you, feel free to check that out on my website. But for this video specifically, the mixing and mastering, I've actually taken that module from the course and pulled it out for individual purchase if that's something you're interested in. So if you're kind of curious to see how I approach this mix step by step, then you might want to check out the mixing and mastering for composers mini course that I've pulled out from Cinematic Music Creation, and I actually mixed this piece from scratch. So that will also be in the description box for you to check out. In case you're interested. But, looking at this piece now from a few weeks to months later, now I can kind of tell you about some of my mixing decisions and go over, exactly what we did. So looking at the overall session, you can see that it's pretty much split into 2 halves. The first half I have here as all MIDI files, and they're all muted with the exception of the first contact instance of each orchestral section. So I've split it up into strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion like usual. But I've left the first track enabled. And the reason is because when I'm bouncing these MIDI tracks to audio, for some reason the first track, the one containing the contact instance always ends up sounding really mono and just very bad in general. So I end up leaving these, the first track of each instance in MIDI, but then all the rest are then bounced to audio. So that's just a small detail. Following that, I decided to color the tracks, which I think is also very important in order to stay organized. So I typically like to keep my strings yellow, my woodwinds blue because they're light and airy, and air is blue. And then the brass is red, and then this percussion is brown. And then the extras are kind of green. Okay? The next thing is we'll go into the mixer window. You'll take a look at the actual processing applied to these tracks. And hopefully you'll notice that there are not actually that many plugins on the tracks in general. The most you'll see is an EQ applied to most of the tracks. And the purpose of those is really to get rid of any unnecessary frequencies that do not need to be there. So if I just open this string, the CSS, for example, and I play it a little bit, let's go maybe over here. Let's have a listen to the string by itself, the violins. So I'm taking out these low frequencies that will just end up eating up your low end, and you don't want that to happen. Then I've also taken out some of this middle register here. It sounded a little bit like wonky honky to me, so I was like, okay, I don't really need that, so I just dragged that out a little bit. And then this top end, I wanted some more of that sizzle and that high end to really let the strings cut through, because CSS is more of a darker library. So without the EQ, you hear how instantly it has that darker sound. But if I put it back on, suddenly you hear the detail in the strings a lot more. You hear how the string is against the bow and everything like that. And it just sounds lighter a little bit. So that's kind of the effect I was going for. And every single instrument will have their own necessary tweaks you'll have to make. Let's take a look at, for example, the oboe here. And this is from, let me just take a look, sorry, BWW, the oboe. There we go. If you have a listen, see where it, oops, I should take that away. Let's actually take a look at where the oboe is actually playing. Do I have it anywhere? Oh, here we go. So it's very, very quiet, right? But basically, I cut out some of the low end just in case there were frequencies there that might just poke up and kind of cloud the mix in general. So it doesn't hurt to apply your EQs just to make sure that things don't end up jutting out in the mix that you don't want them to. So let's take a look at the Hollywood Winds scales, for example. Very cinematic sound without the EQ. So a little darker, a little richer, right? But in the context of this mix, I wanted it to come out a little bit more with the air in the woodwinds, you know? So I brought it a bit of that high end. So another one of the plugins you'll usually see that I use is Valhalla Room. And this is kind of like some extra reverb just to push the instrument a little bit further back in the mix, just in case there's any instruments that are a little too dry. So I'll talk about the send in a little bit, but first of all, let's take a look at the master bus. And this is where I apply most of my processing. So when I start a mix, I tend to go to the master bus first. And the first thing I usually apply is a directional mixer, or any stereo widening or compressing plugin is good here. And as long as you can make the mix mono, that basically forces you to mix in a way that every move you make, it has to be audible and it has to make a difference to the overall mix, or else the things that you're tweaking are not really making that much of a difference, you know? So it forces you to focus on the actual decisions you want to make. And that's why mixing in mono is kind of an interesting concept. So yeah, and then when you open it back up to stereo, it's just going to sound that much better, you know? Then the next thing I like to apply is the EQ. And you can see here I've taken out the low end just a little bit, kind of like below 25. I was like, okay, might as well take just a little bit of that out there. And then overall, the mix sounded a little bit mid-heavy, so I was taking out about, 686 there, so... right? Without it. On. So it sounds a little more cohesive to me, you know? And then a touch of compression just to catch those highest peaks. I mean, the ultimate goal for me was a really, really smooth and dynamic piece of music. And I didn't want the compressor to do too much, but just a little bit so nothing kind of poked out too much. So I used a Logic stock compressor, brought the ratio down to around 1.5, so the amount of compensation is not that much. The amount of, compression is not that much. And then in terms of the makeup, I brought it up about a dB. So that is that. And then I really enjoy using the Greg Wells Mix Centric. It just makes everything sound a little bit spicier, a little more sizzly and brought forward a little bit. So it kind of sounds like this. If I take it off, it's a little more raw, right? But when you bring it in, it's interesting. It feels a little more gelled together, slightly more cohesive. I think without it, you can hear the individual sections slightly more, but with it on, it has that slightly more cohesive quality to it. And then the tone centric, I just brought in for a little bit of warmth, a little bit of saturation. It's very subtle as well. And then finally, at the very, very end, after applying the other processing, I brought in Ozone 8. And so using the Master Assistant, it gave me a really cool preset to work with, where it took out a little bit of the low end, slightly a little bit of the highs, and then boosted a touch of the ultra highs there. And then for the imager, I tend to like moving my slider to about 20 to 21. just because it gives me a nice stereo width that maybe wasn't there before. So it just spreads out the instruments just a little bit more. And then the maximizer is like your limiter in a way. So I found that this default setting just really worked, and it brought it up to a nice level. And then other than that, in terms of the reverb, I used east-west spaces on its own individual channel. I went with the San Francisco Hall, kind of the default I like to go with. I set the dry to 0, and then the wet about 8.5, minus 8.5 with a bit of pre-delay. And then I send individual instruments that are too dry to that reverb. So for example, I sent the entire woodwinds bus to spaces. So if you just have a listen to the woodwinds, take it away, add it back in, off, on, right? So it's interesting. Like there's a little bit more of a wetness to the winds that wasn't there before when it was turned off, and it's the same concept applies for the brass. So using sends for your individual instruments and buses is very, very useful in saving CPU resources. Instead of applying a reverb to the individual tracks themselves, that takes a lot more processing power. And then finally, yeah, you see I've put the EQ on the individual first instances, you know, like this one that I did not bounce to audio. So there's always something that can be fixed, but you know, doing this EQ stuff really helps about like 75 to 80% of your mix, because it clears up all of the unnecessary information that's there. So when you actually start mixing, then you're starting with great source material that's already been taken care of, and all the bad stuff's been stripped away. So that's one of the steps in my mixing process, is like I dedicate an entire hour, 2 hours to really listening to each track and making sure there are no frequencies that will be detrimental to the overall mix once I start getting into it. So that's pretty much it. I do what's called top-down mixing, which is, you know, when I apply the processing to the master bus, and it already makes the entire thing feel a little more cohesive and gel together. And then as I work down to like the groups, I can apply some processing to the groups. And then if any other individual instruments need their own treatment, then I will do that there, you know, lastly. But then one thing that's also very important is automation, because you can't have a good and balanced orchestral piece without some automation. So if you just take a look here, I've done some riding of the volume, and basically for all the important tracks, I was doing that just to make sure the balances were correct. So elements that I didn't want to be brought out into the melody, I've pulled them down, for example. So for example, the violins 1, if we just take a look here. So I started them down, and then decrescendo, very quiet. Right, the strings are very, very quiet, and it's just like the woodwinds that are doing their thing here. So here the strings are kind of quiet. So I'm at minus 8.6 here, minus 5.7, minus 5.2. It's all about figuring out what's the melody, what's the harmony, what are the supporting elements, what are the leading elements, and then just treating them individually so the listener can hear what you want them to hear. Okay, so that's why automation is so important, and you do this for all the tracks that need them. So you know, you can see I've done some pretty, like, it's not crazy automation, but like the ones that I feel that needed a little more balancing, I did do that with subtle automation, and that's kind of the key. I think automation is especially important in orchestral music versus other forms of music, because there's so much detail, there's so much nuance in the instruments, you know, so they need a little more treatment just to make sure it's all balanced correctly. The thing about a live orchestra, however, is that they can balance themselves, you know, and also the conductor is there to balance them as well. So if the strings are playing a nice soaring melody, then the conductor will push down the woodwinds and the brass and say, shh, maybe not so much, you know. And if the percussion have this loud bombastic thing, then the other sections maybe have to support it so they cannot be as loud as the percussion, for example. But as composers and producers, we have to take that into consideration ourselves and think as a conductor, as an orchestrator. So it's like, if this oboe is playing a nice melody, right? It's louder than maybe like a flute, so it can stand on its own a little bit better, but still being a woodwind instrument, it cannot really penetrate through an entire orchestral mix as easily as maybe like a trumpet could. So then you have to take into consideration, like, okay, if the oboe is playing a melody, then maybe I should just accompany it with the strings instead of with a full brass section, because that wouldn't be as realistic in a real setting. So this is if you're going for a realistic type of sound. If not, then you can do whatever you want. And that's kind of the freedom that trailer composers and hybrid composers, sound design composers can have, because they're not really writing for a live ensemble. So it's just really a different approach. But anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. So I want to thank you again for watching this Inside the Score series, where we talked about the theory, the orchestration, and finally the mixing behind it. It's a lot of fun for me to do these series because, I enjoy sharing my process, and I hope you guys are enjoying, watching it and learning a couple things along the way. And yeah, before you go, again, I'd like to remind you that my mixing and processing guide is absolutely free. If you just want to download it in the description box, you can have it. And it'll take you through my exact process of, how I approach a mix every single time I work on music. And then finally, if you're interested in seeing how I actually built this mix up from start to finish, then the entire module called Mixing and Mastering for Composers, where I worked on this piece step by step, is also available in the description box below. It goes a little more in depth than I did here, and you'll get to see every single EQ decision I made, all the reverb, everything, the master fader, all of that. So I think it's pretty interesting. Taking a look at other composers' workflows, I watch, other composers' workflows all the time and kind of see their nuances and how they work. And it's really cool for us to learn from each other. So I want to thank you again for watching, taking the time. I will see you in the next video. Take care, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.